In this video, we're going to take a look at how national governments respond to the needs of people and the role of those governments in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And we're going to kind of go around the horn and look at a few different examples. We're going to look at France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain. And we're going to try to do it in 15 minutes or less because that's when this video gets cut off from recording. So why don't we dive right into it? General trends after 1871 in Europe, as pointed out by McKay, universal male suffrage is the norm, not the exception, in European countries by 1914, and that's been gradually building over the mid and late 19th century. We know that it started a little bit earlier, and it trickled down. It started with giving the middle class the vote in England with the Reform Bill in 1832, and then eventually giving universal male suffrage later on in the century. So it's not something that was just given to everybody overnight. It was earned over time, and it usually went top to bottom in classes. Common people felt a belonging to the national state. The reason for this is because these governments, as I'm going to show you in all the different examples, are doing more to try and keep the working class satisfied and keep the working class supportive of the aims of the government. So competition for working class votes meant that the government had to reach out more than they have before. We saw an example earlier in the 1830s and 1840s with the Whigs and Tories in Great Britain. Laws and conditions are passed to help the average person. So that's what we mean when we talk about responsive national states, because they're responding to the issues and concerns of the guy on the street more so than they have before, where it was usually about the interests of the people in government or the people who were eligible to be in government. And women's suffrage is still a fight. We're not going to see women get the vote until the 20th century. But the movement for the women's vote is ramping up as we head into the turn of the century. There's obviously a downside to these things. For example, manipulation of the people by governments. The government will stir up conflicts, as we saw in the unification of Germany, for motives that are purely, political. And they'll use patriotism to distract from class differences as well. So we don't necessarily want the working class to get, too concerned with upward social mobility. So to distract from that, we'll drum up a small conflict. Those are the kind of things that are happening here and there as a way to make sure that the people are still focused on what the government wants them to do. So it's not a purely, utilitarian attitude. It's not purely, like give the people what they need and that's what we're here for. It was a balance of both. Created minor conflicts abroad, for example, to stoke national unity. We see this with the Franco-Prussian War and German unification. And then conservative movements created imaginary domestic enemies as well, such as Jews, to push agenda and gain support. And we see that with bank failures and economic depression in the 1870s and 1880s. And we'll be looking at that in more detail when we use the Dreyfus Affair as a case study for anti-Semitism. So what's going on in the German Empire? After Germany is unified and Bismarck is the prime minister of the German Empire, we know that they had a hollow democracy. We know that Bismarck and Wilhelm II had the final call and everything. So Bismarck did not answer to the Reichstag per se, but he still sought to engage them again for the purposes of coalition building so that he can do what he wants and has the support to do what he wants when he wants. So he embarks on a really interesting movement called Kulturkampf, which means cultural struggle in German, and it was a series of laws against Catholics. It was his way of trying to kind of like reduce the political power of the Catholics in Germany, and that actually backfired and blew up in his face pretty bad, politically speaking. So Bismarck, ever the realpolitik master, decided that the next best approach is to actually align with the Catholics, and he aligned with the Catholic Center Party to get them on his side. He was also able to gain the support of conservatives and gain the support of farmers by instituting high tariffs on imports. But of course, these protectionist policies are going to lead to some trade wars with their neighbors, and it's one of the causes of World War I. So there's a consequence on the other side of that. But what we're seeing here is that Bismarck, ever the realpolitik master, will do what it takes to get a coalition of many different people under him so that he can really drive his agenda. Bismarck tried to win over the working class as well. The Reichstag created many social welfare programs in the end of the 19th century in Germany, retirement pensions, sickness and accident insurance. And the reason they did this is because, the Socialist Party, the Democratic Socialist Party in Germany, is gaining a lot of steam at this time, and socialism is really taking root within the working class of Germany. And there are communists as well. So Bismarck basically figures the best way to stop that momentum is to beat them at their own game. If the German government can actually provide a lot of the stuff that the socialists are promising if they came to power, then, what do they have to stand on? So it didn't stop the workers from becoming socialists, but it did give them a reason to kind of root for the government, to be supportive of the government. So pretty brilliant on Bismarck's part to basically undercut the platform of the Democratic Socialist Party by providing the things like pensions and sickness and accident insurance that they were calling for. And in that sense, it's interesting historically too, because this idea of the government providing pensions and retirement benefits that we see in Social Security later on in the United States, really the first welfare state in Europe is created under Bismarck in the late 19th century. So governments are trying to gain support through popular programs and welfare states. So the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, was the fastest growing party in Germany at the time. Bismarck tried to outlaw them at first, but he doesn't really get the final say in that because Wilhelm II rises to power, and Wilhelm fires Bismarck as prime minister. It's partly over this, but historians have concluded that the fallout between Wilhelm II and Otto von Bismarck was more about a power struggle for Wilhelm himself. Think about it. Wilhelm I gave Otto von Bismarck the green light when it came to running Germany. Wilhelm II takes the throne and is not comfortable with that power structure, so he challenges Bismarck on a lot of different things, and there's a falling out, and Bismarck's fired. Of course, this is also leading us towards World War I, in the sense that Bismarck was trying to make Germany a satisfied power at the time politically, whereas Wilhelm had a much more aggressive foreign policy. More on that later. So the SPD, anyways, picked up a plurality of seats in the Reichstag at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, but they're less radical by the eve of World War I. For example, they supported imperialism, which is something that hardcore socialists were against, and communists were definitely against, because they saw imperialism as basically taking all the worst parts of capitalism and going out and doing it to the rest of the world. And they actually supported military expansion. The SPD gets caught up in the nationalist fervor going into World War I. So let's switch gears. Let's talk about France. France, as you know, is defeated in the Franco-Prussian War by Germany in 1870. Paris is actually occupied by German forces for a time. And then the chaos and fallout of all this, when Napoleon is deposed, monarchists and conservatives are elected to the National Assembly. This upsets the liberals. The guy in charge at the time, Thiers, is extremely conservative, and there's a backlash to that. So the Paris Commune is an uprising against the conservative government that's put in power at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And the Paris Commune tried to basically create a socialist state in France. And we get back to our typical blood in the streets barricading problem in France. The Paris Commune in the summer of 1870 is actually a nasty, nasty, nasty situation. 25,000 people are killed and another 35,000 are injured when Thiers' forces crush the Paris Commune. So after that, we do establish a third French Republic in France, and a conservative republic with a powerful president and a Senate and a National Assembly is the way that they're going to go. And the Third Republic is actually the longest lasting government since 1789. It's similar in social policies to Germany. Trade unions are legalized once again in France. It's been a while, as you remember talking about that in a previous chapter, to try to gain support of the working class. They offer a free compulsory education by the state. This, of course, makes the Catholic Church nervous because it's a secular education, and we know how staunchly secular French government is. But eventually those tensions are eased, because who's going to pass up a free education from the state? and they build a large overseas empire, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Also, what's going on in Great Britain and Ireland at this time? By 1884, almost every man in Great Britain is allowed to vote. So, like we talked about earlier in the video, the suffrage starts with the middle class, with the Reform Bill, and it's slowly trickling down so that by 1884, just about every man in Great Britain has the vote. The Lords tried to reassert their authority over the House of Commons, but this rejected, and they do so by rejecting the People's Budget, which is the social program package, but they are forced by the king at the time to actually allow it. Social welfare programs are passed by the Labour Party in the early 1900s. The Labour Party in Great Britain is comparable to the Social Democratic Party in Germany or the Socialist Party in France. The Irish famine that we talked about in the previous chapter, though, is creating a problem in Ireland and is radicalizing the Irish against the British. So Parliament does respond to a point by easing restrictions on the Irish, but we still have some issues in Ireland. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, said that he was on a mission to pacify Ireland. He wanted to smooth over the tensions with Ireland. So in 1913, his government proposes home rule for Ireland, which is a similar situation as, say, in Canada, where they're still under the British Crown, but they get to make their own decisions. This is a big hit with the Irish, but it's a problem with the Protestants in Northern Ireland. In the county of Ulster in particular, there is a majority Protestants, whereas the rest of Ireland is Catholic. But when I say majority Protestant, it's neighborhood by neighborhood. So in Belfast, for example, one neighborhood could be Protestant, a couple streets over, it's Catholic. And typically in those Catholic neighborhoods, they're sympathetic with the rest of Ireland. In the Protestant neighborhoods, a lot of British settlers that have called Belfast home. So the Ulsterites are a group of people who are afraid that they're getting left to the dust and being thrown to the wolves with the rest of Ireland by issuing home rule. So the Ulsterites gained 100,000 armed volunteers to push back against Irish home rule. And support for Ulsterites is obviously pretty strong over in Britain. And this forces the hand of Parliament to exempt Northern Ireland from the Home Rule Charter. So when Ireland gets its Home Rule, which it will finally get in 1916, it gets caught up a little bit with World War I. Northern Ireland, so the county of Ulster, including Belfast, will not receive home rule and is still under direct control of Great Britain. And even to this day, there's still issues in Northern Ireland over this. So just very quickly, Austria-Hungary, what's going on over there? The Magyar Hungarians tried, like so many others in 1848, to achieve independence. After the 7 Weeks' War and they failed, by the way. After the 7 Weeks' War in Austria in 1866, they see an opportunity here because Austria is just way too weak to stop the Hungarians from breaking away and creating their own country. So the compromise that Austria is able to strike with the Hungarians is a system called dual monarchy, which grants self-rule for the Hungarians, but they're still under the same emperor, and finance, foreign, and defense issues will still be under the Emperor of Austria. Everything else, the Hungarians can run their own show within that part of the empire. They also expand compulsory education, but the catch here is that you either get your education in German or you get it in Magyar and Hungarian. And it doesn't matter if you're one of the many, many other cultural identities across the empire. Those are your only two choices. So while this is great for Austrians, it's great for Hungarians. It further alienates the other cultural identities in the Balkan areas of the of the Austrian Empire. So ethnic minorities resent this Austro-Hungarian government, and nationalism was actually ripping this empire apart. Because as nationalism gets stronger everywhere in Europe, it also gets stronger within these smaller cultural identities in the multinational empires such as Austria-Hungary, and it's going to create a huge problem when we get to World War I, as you know.